All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining Earth Destruction by a Different Name, Dispelling the Myths of a Renewable Transition. I think I'm going to guess that if you're logging on, I don't need to convince you that this is an urgent topic to discuss as we make this rapid transition to a renewable energy technology-based future. As Bill was just noting, and as I wanted to share, I mean, our cultural conditioning very much is such that we think we can grow and innovate our way out of any problem. Of course, when growth is the problem, that's not going to be true. The challenge, however, is combating all the wishful thinking and propaganda that is conveying that we can solve the climate crisis, the nature crisis, the social and environmental injustice crises, and everything else by growing a sparkly new renewable energy economy where everyone drives around in electric vehicles, perhaps with the car driving itself while the passengers and even the drivers explore the metaverse. Or maybe even just staying home and inhabiting the metaverse fully in the first place, growing our disconnect even further from our communities and from nature. For a Gaian like me who wants to inhabit the real and living world, it's a nightmarish scenario. Certainly not as nightmarish as runaway climate change, but not a utopian vision I aspire to. Which is why I'm excited to introduce our speakers today. First, we're going to hear from Bill Rees, Professor Emeritus of the University of British Columbia and co-creator of the Ecological Footprint Indicator, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, the one that warns us every year that we are using up 1.75 planets of biocapacity and thus depleting Earth's natural capital. I've had the pleasure of knowing Bill for many years now, at least a decade, when he wrote for State of the World 2013 and helped map out what a real one planet society would look like. After that, John Mulrow, Professor of Environmental and Ecological Engineering at Purdue University, will speak. I got to know John when we both worked together on the Transforming Cultures project at the World Watch Institute, where I was a researcher. We've been friends and collaborators ever since, grappling with what the marriage of the degrowth and circular economy would look like, for example, and more recently, working to explore what a Gaian philosophy would look like. And finally, Miriam Stevens will talk. Miriam is a PhD student in Environmental and Ecological Engineering at Purdue, who primarily works on modeling the expected availability of reusable battery critical materials in the US. I have not known Miriam as much as John and Bill, but I did get the wonderful chance to meet her at the Degrow US conference back in 2018, and I'm glad she'll be wrapping up the panel and even grappling with some of the more difficult aspects of the necessary transitions we face. So with introductions made, I turn it over to Bill.
Thank you very much, Erik. Yeah, here, am I there? Yeah.
You are.
Thank you. And welcome everyone to this discussion. I'm honored to be able to provide a kind of overview for what the session will be all about. So I'll do that by sharing a series of slides. This first one kind of sets up a temporal perspective on where we are. People forget that human beings have been around for 300,000 or 250,000 years. And for 99.99% of that time, growth was not an issue. We simply didn't grow. Positive and negative feedback maintained human populations in balance around the planet. And then there was a slight bump up with agriculture, but most specifically, early in the 19th century, perhaps late 18th century, we began to use fossil fuels in great quantities. And since then, there has been a 1,400-fold increase in our use of fossil fuels, an 8-fold increase in populations from just 1 billion to 8 billion, and an increase in real world product of 103-fold in just the last 200 years. So it's really interesting to me, at any rate, that we've seen only 200 years of explosive population, economic, and energy use growth. And we take this as our culture to be the norm. when in fact, this recent growth spurt that has been enjoyed by perhaps 10 generations of humans is actually the single most abnormal period in human history. And I have to point out that it's entirely credible to attribute this to our capacity to acquire resources using fossil fuel. Abundant, cheap energy is the key to understanding a human population, economic, and general growth. So we can see this clearly here. Here's a curve showing the increase in oil, gas, and coal, the primary fossil fuels, plotted with population. And there's a lockstep relationship between these two factors for as long as we've been using fossil fuels. And again, we reached 8 billion people in November 2022, up from 1 billion just 200 years ago. So in 1/2050th as much time as it took humans to reach 1 billion, we increased an additional 7 billion. Why is this not working? Here we go. Here's a correlation between primary energy consumption and gross world product. So again, it makes very clear that the increase in economic activity on Earth is entirely powered by the availability of abundant, cheap energy. And that has been historically almost entirely fossil fuel. One of the results, of course, is the steady increase in atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide. That's what's shown with the jagged red line here. And what we've done with this curve is plot the various climate meetings and agreements against that curve. So we've had something like 27 COP conferences now, the last one at Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt in November of last year. But there's been many other significant events. The Limits to Growth was published in 1972. The first World Scientists' Warning to Humanity back in 1992. 27 COP conferences and a number of other agreements. But the point is, none of them seem to have had any effect on the steady uptick. In fact, it's an exponential increase in carbonate concentrations in the atmosphere. Now, arguably, and I suppose it's true, this would have been worse in the absence of these things. But if the goal is to reduce the carbon concentrations in the atmosphere, then all of our efforts to date have been abysmal failures. And the problem is that we are still largely fossil fuel dependent. Despite all the hype we hear about the green energy transition taking over and we'll be able to have 100% renewable energy by 2050, that's a very short period of time, all things considered. The reality is that we're still about 80% fossil fuel dependent, and only 4 to 5 or some say 6% of the world's final energy consumption has been wind and solar, which is where 94% of investment has been going in recent years. And to put this in perspective, if you think on an annualized basis, fossil energy powered the world for 300 of 365 days in 2021. And wind and solar gave us at most just 18 days. So there's no conceivable way, given a variety of limitations, which my fellow speakers will talk about, that we could achieve anything remotely like energy equivalence by 2050 using a green energy transition. We are stuck with and will continue to be dependent on fossil fuel for the foreseeable future, regrettably, because of the climate conundrum. So what we're getting in the manner of discussion around this kind of issue is the so-called green energy transition. I call this business as usual by alternative means, because all it would do, were it successful, and by the way, I think there's no chance whatever of its being successful, but were it successful, as everyone says and thinks it will be, then it merely provides us a different energy basis for our continued scouring of the planetary barrel. Human activity right now is major geological changing the face of the Earth, causing the extinction of non-human species, for example. And an alternative source of energy in equivalence to supply to fossil fuel would merely allow this to be continued. So energy transition is business as usual by alternative means, and it actually means a worsening climate, rising CO2 emissions, and an extended overshoot, leading to potential collapse. What we really should be talking about is ways of reducing our ecological footprints, our absolute consumption of energy and material, and of getting some grip on the human population conundrum. We need a form of equitable sustainability into the next century, and we're not even willing to discuss the real way of getting there via current means. I love this cartoon, Horsey's cartoon. I've changed the caption in the balloon there. It's all settled. We agreed to replace the coal-powered engines with electric motors. William Ophuls wrote a wonderful little pamphlet called Electrifying the Titanic, and that's really what we're doing. So I'm also going to make the case that in any case, climate change isn't the real issue. It's simply one co-symptom of a much larger problem called overshoot. Human beings have very limited intellectual capacity, despite what we might think of ourselves. We tend to be simplistic in our thinking. We focus on one issue at a time, on simple cause-effect relationships, when in fact we're dealing with extremely complex systems that no person can really wrap his mind around. And so with that singular focus, climate change is the issue, or the pandemic is the issue, or the war in Ukraine is the issue. And no one makes the effort to really connect the dots and to show that all of these things are in some way connected in a very complex systemic way. Overshoot means that the human enterprise as a whole, because of the growth model, has exceeded the long-term carrying capacity of Earth. We're depleting the ecosphere faster than ecosystems can regenerate, and we're dumping wastes into the system much in excess of the ecosphere's assimilative capacity. To put it more simply, there's just too damn many people consuming too much. And if you say that out loud, you're condemned for being a neo-fascist or a racist or whatever. There's nothing neo-fascistic or racist about this. It's simply a matter of simple fact. And my overriding issue here is that overshoot is the overriding meta problem. It's the cause of every other ecological and even social issue that you hear about. So biodiversity loss, the acidification of the oceans, land and soil degradation, gross inequity and increasing inequity are all associated with or co-symptoms of the problem of overshoot, along with climate change. My final real point I want to get at here is that human beings are organic systems. We are a species. We are embedded in ecosystems. And so we have this, frankly, incredible disconnect between the way we think economically and the nature of reality. So you will hear often of the economy decoupling from nature, or the fact that economic production is dematerializing. Well, that is the artifact of faulty accounting. If we look at actual energy and material flows through the system, as we do with ecological footprint analysis, we can show that human beings are right now the largest, or at least the dominant consumer organism in every single major ecosystem on the planet, and that is increasing. Human beings are taking a larger and larger proportion of net primary production from ecosystems at the expense of all the rest of nature. We now constitute 34% of the biomass of mammals on Earth. Our domestic animals are another 60+%. So wild mammals have been reduced to 3 to 4% of the total mass of biomass on Earth. So here we have humans, by far the largest component of most of the world's ecosystem, while we're operating from an economic model that pretends we are decoupling and dematerializing. It's absolute nonsense. Well, the problem is that we see the overshoot in nature with other species. So under favorable conditions, every species, humans included, are capable of geometric or exponential growth. So when conditions are favorable, we will have a population boom in every single species that's ever been explored. So with humans, our favorable conditions really began in the early 19th century, late 18th perhaps, with the application and use of fossil fuels, because fossil fuels are the means by which we acquired all the other food and other resources necessary to grow the human population, the whole of the human system. So we have had that extraordinary boom that we looked at in my very first slide. But of course, in nature, when resource depletion occurs, there's always a population crash. And I am convinced that that's the direction we're headed. So I put together this little curve to make the point. We, like that other curve, look at the parallels here, are capable of geometric or exponential growth under favorable conditions. But as we grow, we begin to reach and then exceed carrying capacity. We go into a state of overshoot. But with overshoot, we're depleting the biophysical basis of our own existence. So if carrying capacity is the horizontal dotted line, we, through overshoot, produce the horizontal and then diminishing red line. We are reducing the ultimate carrying capacity of Earth by depleting the soils, our energy bases, forests, biodiversity, and so on and so forth. So at some point, and I think we're way up here, you are here, we are approaching the peak, at which point the system will no longer be able to sustain human beings at anything like our current levels of consumption, even average levels of consumption, and the system will collapse. Both populations and economic consumption will deteriorate. And we won't be able to do any better than to follow the dotted red line because we've reduced the long-term carrying capacity of the planet. By the way, had we been a truly intelligent species, we certainly had the information and knowledge to follow the green line. The green line is one in which, of course, we have growth. Every system grows and matures to a point where it should stabilize within the carrying capacity of its environment. Every system doesn't do that, but that's what we should have done. And we call that one planet living. The little graphic, I didn't know Erik was going to show it, but it's a paper I did way back in the, I guess it was 2013. We talked about, can we still achieve one planet living? Well, that's what it means. It means achieving a level of average material consumption at a population in which we can have a material abundance without depleting the essential natural capital assets of the planet. So that's my story. I think we're in a very tight situation. We've misdiagnosed the problem. We cannot solve any problem that we do not understand. And the mainstream either doesn't understand the problem or is deliberately subverting our efforts to attack this problem realistically. The energy transition won't do it. That's simply a symptom of human trivial thinking, our simplification and reductionist approach to just about everything, and it's doomed to failure. And that's all I have to say. I hope my colleagues can argue with a little bit of this, but I think we'll see some agreement as we move through the morning. Thank you. Afternoon.
Thank you, Bill. I'm going to turn it over to John, but while he's transitioning slides, this is a good chance to just remind the audience and welcome everybody to just, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll answer all questions at the end of the talk.
All right, can you hear me all right? Okay. Well, it's pretty cool to follow Bill Rees in a speaking event. You know, I think Bill's a known quantity, and I worked with Erik at the World Watch Institute when we were putting together the State of the World 2013. So here we are 10 years later. And I, on that note, I felt that maybe I should give a little bit more background, so maybe I can justify why I'm on this panel. But I am a visiting assistant professor here at Purdue, so I work with Miriam in the Environmental and Ecological Engineering department, also on the leadership circle of the Gaian Way. The way I describe my research, the aim of my research here at Purdue is twofold. A, accounting for the full functioning of the economy when we do life cycle assessment and environmental impact assessment generally. And then B, situating any analysis of goods and services, food, water, energy, transportation in a global context, keeping in mind that good materials and energy flow in a global economy, not just within political borders. Where I'm coming from on this, my undergraduate degrees environmental science. My graduate degrees are in civil engineering. But before I returned to academia, I worked in climate policy with Erik in DC, I spent 2 years in Zambia with the UN Refugee Agency doing solar panel installations. And then I spent about 6 years working in municipal solid waste consulting in the San Francisco and Chicago areas. So in my work as a corporate sustainability consultant, I became increasingly concerned about the fact that typical environmental solutions are actually business as usual efficiency gains. So Bill, to you said this, and I literally have this written down because I wrote a little intro for myself. I wrote, when we save companies or households money when we save them money by installing more efficient appliances, generating electricity with rooftop solar panels, this kind of array of solutions we've heard about, we tend to add to the supply of goods and services, the available supply, not reduce demand. Some people call this the Jevons paradox or rebound effects. I call it business as usual. It's how we operate the economy even prior to the arrival of fossil fuels. So the rebranding of business as usual with green dressing goes way beyond rebound effects, ride sharing, the circular economy as good old waste management, autonomous vehicles that drive more efficiently, or I teach an undergraduate class this semester on industrial sustainability, and I was just giving them an example yesterday. Billiard balls. I don't know if folks know this, but the modern billiard ball which is made of plastic materials, was developed as an alternative to ivory when the price of ivory was skyrocketing post-Civil War. Basically, importing ivory to the US was super expensive. Companies scrambled to make an alternative. We came up with celluloid, wood balls covered in celluloid that developed into Bakelite in 1907. And I share with my students kind of this whole array of items that are substitutes between fossil fuel based and natural based materials, and then kind of how they were talked about at the time. So you have, kerosene replacing whale oil, for example. But I love this quote. It's from a celluloid manufacturing company marketing pamphlet in 1878. And it says, "Thus, as petroleum came to the relief of the whale, has celluloid given the elephant, the tortoise, and the coral insect a respite in their native haunts, and it will no longer be necessary to ransack the earth in pursuit of substances which are constantly growing scarcer." So this was a marketing line for the sale of plastics. And I think it's interesting that we've come kind of full circle where, because fossil fuels are the problem, the solution is clearly products made of alternative materials, not less consumption. So that's bothered me. That bothered me in the corporate world, and that's why I got back into academia, to kind of dig into our methods for environmental assessment. So I'm going to give a quick rundown. Whenever we talk about this topic, are we facing limits? Are there limits to growth? We inevitably stimulate a whole bunch of what ifs. What if we went 100% solar? What if we got cars converted as fast as possible? What if everyone heated their home with a heat pump and we got rid of natural gas stoves? And what if AI took over and did things more efficiently, right? So I want to, since this audience is a little bit, we're kind of preaching to the choir here, I just want to give people some of my thoughts about how I talk about these items in the classroom, bring them up from a scientific perspective to tackle some of these what ifs. And I want to focus on the energy transition as renewable, efficient, and high speed, and focus in on those three metrics. Erik, what have I got? 10 more minutes? Okay. So I've got stuff in the way here. All right, I'll just go with it. The energy transition, it's a term. We talk about the energy transition. It's a known quantity, and it has three main attributes: more renewables, more electrification, and more efficient. And those are supposed to add up to less global carbon emissions. And the energy transition is usually talked about in a purely carbon context, even though, of course, there's plenty of other ecosystemic attributes and systems on Earth that we are pushing up against and in fact exceeding. The issues with this are that renewable energy requires a combination of naturally replenishing energy and finite non-renewable materials, and efficiency doesn't lower total emissions without restrictions on use, period. All right, something I talk about pretty often in class. We have 3 different renewable energies available to us here on Earth. Most of that is solar income. There's some ongoing radioactive decay that gives us geothermal heat, and there's the gravitational pull of the moon, but mostly it's solar. And what I'm going to argue next is that solar energy is involved in every single energy system on Earth. All energy systems, the way we colloquially talk about energy, means available and usable energy. And all available energy requires at least 2 inputs. You need one side of the equation and the other side of the equation. So just to give you an example, and my argument is that the reactant 1 and reactant 2 tend to be a renewable natural resource and a finite natural resource. Of course, there are no other resources besides natural ones. Okay, so just some quick examples. Corn for biofuels. Renewable because the sun drives photosynthesis. Non-renewable because they require finite elements, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium for the most part. A solar-powered electric vehicle. Renewable because it's powered and electrified by solar rays. Non-renewable because the batteries contain an array of minerals. Those batteries are not simply machines. They wear out over time. This is just a very simplified picture of battery degradation, but a battery degrades by oxidation, by dendrite formation, so mechanical and physical degradation over time. That's why you get a dead battery that needs to be recycled. So in the same way we degrade fossil fuels by combusting them, we will degrade batteries by running a battery-based renewable energy system. Geothermal, again, free heat from the earth, supporting equipment for water. I had a little bit of more trouble fitting this one. But a big important point I talk about is that fossil fuels require oxygen. In this sense, you could imagine an economy that grew up, say, on batteries and solar panels instead of fossil fuels. And then we started to be limited on battery materials. So somebody dug up some fossil fuels from the ground and found that they combust in air. I could see a present, if you flipped history on its head, if you kind of flipped it this way, you could see fossil fuels being marketed as oxygen energy, right? It's 2/3 of the material that goes into your car engine when you're driving along the highway. 2/3 of the mass material being used in the engine is actually atmospheric oxygen. So I just do this as a fun little thought exercise to say that we could label, rigorously scientifically based, we could label almost anything as renewable energy. And that kind of turns this whole concept of renewable as a dichotomy or as an opposite to non-renewable over. It says that difference doesn't actually exist. We'll make sure to share slides, and just Erik, a little side note, we are going to share the video, right, via YouTube or something. I got a few questions in the chat about that. Okay, so we'll share slides so you can, if you want to dig into this kind of usable energy model that I developed, there's a link here. Okay, so some things that I conclude here: renewable energy is not sustainable energy. Renewable energy, generating usable energy requires natural resources, full stop, no matter what. And usable energy is always used to do something. There's a great line from a French writer called Alan Gras, who says that the energy transition leads to a new kind of digging activity. So it's one digging activity to a new kind of digging activity. Also, efficient is not sustainable. I don't need to repeat the Jevons paradox to this crowd, but I think that a lot of times I hear people talking about the Jevons paradox, and maybe we don't go back and look at the actual source of it. It's pretty interesting. Here's James Watt's, so I teach this in class when I teach energy, but James Watt's first patent for a steam engine in 1769 is titled Watt's Method of Lessening the Consumption of Steam and Fuel in Fire Engines. So people were like, yes, we're going to lessen steam and fuel use with these engines. Of course, Stanley Jevons came along in 1865. He wrote a very extensive treatment of the British coal industry. And here is actually what he said. He never uses the word paradox. He says, it is wholly, this is way better than just a paradoxical statement. It is wholly a confusion of ideas to suppose that the economical use of fuel is equivalent to a diminished consumption. The very contrary is the truth. And no one must suppose that coal thus saved is spared. It is only saved from one use to be employed in others, and the profits gained soon lead to extended employment in many new forms. So how did we end up with, this film? This is a clip. You recognize this probably from An Inconvenient Truth, which was one of the films that got me fired up about the environment when I was in college in 2006. But looking back at it, it's like, how did we end up with this graph as the concluding, here's what you can do graph? It's this kind of classic wedges. Here's how we're going to wedge down carbon emissions. And all of these categories off on the right are efficiency, except for renewables. So how did Jevons write this paradox, and very well-researched paradox, over 100 years ago, and we still ended up with this? Well, I want to present something kind of interesting. If we actually track where carbon emissions went, it does follow Al Gore's graph pretty well. This is for the US. According to our standard accounting for carbon emissions, we have been going down, and we're actually following this kind of wedge graph. And I have no doubt that the economy is getting more efficient. But again, to my earlier point, the economy is global. So here's the US graph, but here's what's been happening globally. Upper middle income countries total, so this is the United States in red, and then every other upper middle income country in, that's the world total up there. Every upper middle income country here in gold, lower and middle income countries total here in this tan, and then the brown line at the bottom. So maybe the US has gotten more efficient, but if we've simply released that energy, and you could say rightly so, to the rest of the world to use. And that's the equation that the Earth system cares about. So there's a criticism of standard US environmental language here, but there's also kind of a message about the global economy. And the last point I want to make is that high speed is also not sustainable. We talk about the need for a rapid transition. I have a quick diagram that I really don't have time to get too far into, but this is a method that I'm working on in my research, is to point out changes in speed and power over time and how they drive environmental impact. So if you increase the speed of a system, the potential speed of a car, the potential power or turnover of an engine, or the automation of a process, you create time availability. When time availability goes up, humans use it to do additional activities, create new wants and needs, which shifts impact into different categories. Efficiency is just another word for speeding up. It tends to be used that way in a growth economy. And this is how speed also relates to increases in impact. Okay, I'm not going to read this slide just verbatim, but my takeaways are that renewable energy requires a combination of naturally replenishing and finite resources. Efficiency does not lower total emissions without restrictions on use, and a fast transition could commit us to high speed and high power technological systems that lock in unsustainable demand levels. My concluding note is that we must address economic growth as a root cause of our sustainability problem. And to that note, I'll make sure that we link to this, but our degrowth, we have a little monthly degrowth club here at Purdue, mostly environmental science and engineering students discussing this macroeconomic issue in the field of ecological economics. We created a 2-page introduction to degrowth that I'll make sure to share. And then the organization Degrow US is hosting a virtual general assembly on the evening of May 24th. And we'll make sure everybody gets details on that event. And in the slides, I'll include some links to further studies. With that, I will stop sharing and pass it over to Miriam.
Thank you, John. And as Miriam, you're getting your slides up, is a good reminder. We can put those links up after either under the YouTube video or on the Gaianism website so that you have access to the slides and everything.
Great.
Okay, are you all seeing my screen, my presentation? Great. Yeah, so thanks, John and everyone. So I'm gonna just jump right into what I'm gonna be talking about today. I think my introduction that was given was pretty accurate and sums up why I'm here and why I'm talking about this. So I'm currently a PhD student who's primarily studying the potential for availability of secondary materials that we could use to make things to power the renewable energy transition. Because I am concerned that, like lots of people, we're going to run out eventually, and that the US, who has the most power to acquire these things, will take advantage of their ability to do so. And in order to ensure that we can transition to the global economy to away from fossil fuels fairly, we need to be mindful of how much large nations are consuming. So to get started, I'm also going to try and move these Zoom things out of the way. All right, so I'm going to start by talking about looking at global resource use, of which society's hopeful transition is to cleaner energy is probably going to follow a similar path, and how that tracks with conventional measures of economic progress and why our plans don't seem to be working. So we're going to first start by talking about the difference between two strategies for bringing our economic activities back into line with environmental limits, and that is green growth versus degrowth. So green growth is an economic strategy that seeks to separate or decouple the benefits of increasing economic activity from their induced negative environmental impact. So Bill talked a little bit, Bill and John, I'd say, talked both about this, and this is just going to go slightly more in depth about it. So it comes from this idea that decoupling would mean that we can separate the negative or ills from economic activity from their benefits. And so what would be needed to actually achieve this? So GDP, or gross domestic product, which is how we measure economic progress, would need to be absolutely decoupled from the material and energy intensity. And also this decoupling would have to happen fast enough in order to be able to meet socio-ecological goals like the global emissions reduction targets. But is this possible? So these charts also summarize some of what's already been said so far, but so we see in three groups, both the US, the EU, and then the OECD, so a group of large economies, these three metrics that can be used to track green growth. So we have GDP in blue. DMC is domestic material consumption, and so it's measurement of the materials that are consumed within a nation. But the material footprint includes all of the embodied materials. So what's consumed outside of a nation in order to provide for the actual consumption within a political boundary. And so we see that GDP is increasing over time, which is good in terms of how we measure our economies. And also that the domestic material consumption, which is often used to track this green growth, seems to be decoupling, seems to have been starting to decouple from at least these larger economies since the 1900s or late 1990s. But if we look at the material footprint, which I'd argue is a more accurate measurement of consumption, we see that it's actually pretty much tracking GDP exactly. And so there was a little bit of decoupling outside of the US, but in about 2010, we can see that material consumption is actually starting to recouple with GDP. And in the US in particular, it's never decoupled, it's only gone up faster than GDP. So comparing GDP to domestic material consumption is often done, and it shows a relative decoupling, but it's a bit of a false metric because it includes the consideration of embodied consumption. And so very slowly, there is a growing consensus that continued economic growth, especially as measured by GDP, on a global scale, while meeting environmental goals isn't working as planned, which is where ideas like degrowth come in as an alternative. And so degrowth and other related terms like stable living state or post-growth economy, steady state economy, they recognize this impossibility of absolute decoupling and look for solutions to the root of the problem, which, as has already been said, is that an economy that inherently has to continue to grow indefinitely in order to provide for those in it will eventually outgrow the carrying capacity of the earth. So since we have seen that green growth is not happening, just looking at these global material footprint on a global level instead of focusing on just large economies. So we see global material footprint has only continued to increase over time from the chart on the right, with non-metallic minerals being the largest share of that, and metal ores, which will make up a lot of the materials that are needed for the energy transition in blue. And so we're going to substantially increase the amount of materials extracted for that. And so likely this global material footprint is only going to continue to increase. Also with biomass, if we try and switch a lot of our products to away from fossil fuel derived sources, if we switch them to biomass, that's also only going to continue to go up. And so in the chart on the right, we see global GDP, again, compared to material footprint. And on the global level, we also see that there was a bit of decoupling happening decades ago, but in 2010, the economy started essentially rematerialize. And so material footprint, again, surpassed GDP and at least the rate at which it's growing. So this decoupling is not happening fast enough. And another strategy is needed, which could be this planned downscaling of resources in order to bring the economy back into balance with the planet in both a safe and just way. So something important to keep in mind when looking at charts like this is that this constant increase, it's really reflective of the large economies. So countries that are highly developed and not those that have small economies or the developing countries or developing economies. And so who is consuming these resources is really important to keep in mind when thinking about how we can reduce resource consumption and for whom. So I see two major issues with a growing global material footprint that's also paired with unequal exchange, unequal ecological exchange. And so the first is that this rapid decarbonization of the global north risks a new kind of green extractivism in nations that are already affected more by climate change and potentially overstepping other planetary boundaries in the process. So green extractivism would be a return to removing large amounts of unprocessed materials from developing countries in particular. It could be from any country, but those are the places where we usually remove these large amounts of material and then using them in mature economies to create value-added products. So this rush to acquire these materials for the energy transition is just an example of extractivism in a different form. And it will likely lead to consequences like ecological damage and biodiverse hotspots where these resources are concentrated. Could also lead to workers' rights issues and pollution from increased rapid extraction that's not as regulated as it would be in nations that have the regulation and oversight and capability to do that. And also seeking materials in such a hasty way that culturally sensitive areas are at risk of being disturbed in the process. So things like sacred places, if there are materials that are desired underneath of them and those with the money and the power to access them want to do so, those places are at risk of being damaged or destroyed. And so secondly, the second issue is that without globally coordinated materials use targets, I think it will be even harder to avoid these continued inequities in wealth and environmental impacts as all countries continue to try and progress within the current trade regimes. And so this is also why a downscaling of resource consumption by those who do it most is desirable and necessary in order for our global economy to continue. Yes, so how can we address this conundrum? One option would be to set global material budgets similar to greenhouse gas emissions budgets, and then allocate a portion to all nations based on a fair share principle. So this chart shows some early work to start to identify what these global material budgets might look like. So based on global consumption of both bio-based and non-bio-based resources, the authors of this study, they proposed that a material footprint of approximately 5 tons per person would be a fair share of materials use. They would also help preserve environmental integrity. And this 5 ton per person is actually less than they thought would be most preservative, but it was something that they thought could possibly be achievable. And so as we can see, the largest economies consume much more than this amount currently. And so reaching this material footprint will be even more difficult given that the consumption of metal ores shown in blue here will need to increase substantially in order to support the energy transition. But we do see, like, for example, the per capita consumption in India, there is some room to grow. And that's likely the case in other smaller economies. But where that big reduction needs to happen is in the larger economies like the US. So with regards specifically to metals, there's also some initial work underway to develop material specific targets. But most of these targets so far have been set in regards to limiting greenhouse gas emissions, but have not included other environmental limits that are also important. And so this task for setting global consumption limits for metals is especially challenging since the dynamics of the environmental impact of metals is not fully understood, and how it relates to certain ecosystem services and that sort of thing. So to illustrate this recent work to set metal consumption targets, at least with emissions budgets, is this chart, which shows the per capita in use stock of metals as it has existed and to what level it would need to reach in order for global extraction by nations of certain income groups to be in line with the amount that keeps metal extraction as a whole within the global emissions budget for the whole sector. And so this is global limits on material consumption, whether it be of metals or biomass or other materials, is one option for bringing our consumption back into line with planetary boundaries, similar to what we tried to do with greenhouse gas emissions. But we've had so much trouble following our emissions target or achieving our emissions targets that it's hard to kind of imagine even being able to achieve things like this. And not even, I guess, like discussing the whole other areas of work that need to be done to fundamentally like change the way labor and activity is incentivized in the economy. Like global material budgets is something that could be done in the system that we have to limit resource use today. So yeah, this is my final slide on this subject, and I have some references, but if we're going to share the slides, then those will be available to you all. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Miriam. That's an exciting new concept. I hadn't heard of global material budgets, and I'm going to maybe start the Q&A with a question to you, but I think one theme that is resonating across all three of your presentations is be wary of the technological transition. And I would add one more element of that, just, as I'm reading more and more about the hydrogen transition as well, the new studies that are coming out with, recognizing that leaking hydrogen is starting to disrupt the climate's or the atmosphere's ability to break down methane, right? So there's all these hidden surprises that as we pursue this exciting, renewable, although as John noted, not necessarily environmentally sustainable energy transition, there's might be a lot more surprises that come along with it. So I'm sure some of the questions are going to revolve around solutions. And Miriam, you gave a very specific one, and I want to start there, but I'm sure John and Bill, you'll have some thoughts about that as well. So I'll just prime you for thinking about that. And Miriam, I guess my curiosity with that, because it's so new to me, these global material budgets, how far along in that conversation are researchers? Have the questions, the nuanced questions of, does that fit alongside carbon budgets? Has that come up? Is it already exploring whether this is a cap, a limit, or maybe a tax on materials, and what the most strategic way within our current system to kind of limit that material extraction?
So the work I'm familiar with, so I'm not familiar with any active attempts to set consumption targets on the global level right now. I know that individual nations are limiting and setting laws that state what can and cannot be exported from their country. But right now, this really seems to be just still in the research phase. Yeah, because we're just beginning to understand, or before you can set targets like that, you need to have a very good understanding of why you're setting them and exactly what types of environmental impacts you're trying to avoid in setting them. But with resource extraction, it's not like the carbon budget in that we don't know exactly how much is available, because we're always discovering new resources. And it's also tricky because I guess what is and isn't off limits, or what is and shouldn't be included in that is also up for debate. So should we mine the seafloor? That would add a lot to the available materials. But what are the implications of doing that? We're really not sure.
Thank you. And I'll answer that question. No, we should not mine the seafloor. Please, if people have questions and you want to do it the old school way, raise your hand, or use the Zoom, raise your hand, or just put it in the chat, whatever way you want.
Well, I have a question.
Tom, go ahead.
Thank you. I think it's the elephant in the room here. I find these discussions fascinating, that particularly the people who are so versed in the technical side of things are taking such a careful look at what we imagine are our policy pathways toward achieving something like a lighter footprint on the planet. But I want to ask you guys if you had to place a bet on whether we would get to that lighter footprint by virtue of the natural trends that are unfolding now and driving us up against a wall, or by means of international politics and diplomacy, where would you put your money?
I would have said that I would have made a very pessimistic bet before I started this current job at Purdue, only because it's been very easy to talk about degrowth. And I think that our monthly discussions, mostly grad students and faculty members, have grown to like 20, 30 people at times, getting together to talk ecological economics and limits to growth. That's clearly, that's a drop in the bucket, 30 people at a university, and degrowth is very stuck in academia at the moment. But at least that has, knowing that I'm not tiptoeing around talking about it anymore, people ask about it. I can easily go, I sat on a panel for the Purdue Policy Research Institute, a panel on electrified transportation a few weeks ago. And just, we had a whole degrowth discussion there amongst electric vehicle researchers and semiconductor researchers and AI folks. So the fact that it's easier, that there's some people are looking for not just the techno solution, gives me some hope, changes my bet a little bit. I'm not saying it's a bet that will make it through the crunch.
If I had to comment on this, I think I say we're not going to see the degrowth happen because of voluntary actions by human beings. I mean, much of the technical literature tells us what we need to do And I suppose a lot of it is technologically possible. There was a wonderful book written a few years ago by some friends and colleagues of mine called Factor 5. And it showed that if we were really smart, we have off-the-shelf technology right now by which we could essentially maintain our current material well-being with about a fifth of the energy and material use. But it requires a tremendous readjustment of the way we run the economy in terms of pricing goods and services, ecological taxation, and so on and so forth. So the bottom line is that technologically a great deal is possible.
Right.
That's the what we need to do. Where we're falling behind horribly, and it's too bad we don't have more social sciences even interested in this question, is the how of it. How do we get 8 billion people, or even 20% of 8 billion people, to agree to the kinds of huge changes that have to occur in our economic and social structures in order to bring this about? So let's be realistic. We've all talked a little bit about here about how most of the damage done so far has been done by first world countries. Something like 25% of the population have imposed 75% of the burden on the planet. We still have a quarter of the world's people who have nothing close to material adequacy. So if we really are serious, and people talk about equity and among the current 8 billion people, if we want to raise the poor people on Earth today to a decent material standard without utterly destroying the planet, it means that wealthy countries have to reduce their material and energy throughput by something like 80%, 80% per capita. Now that's a hard sell if you're a politician. So this, by the way, is called reduction in convergence or convergence.
Contraction and convergence.
Right, that's right. So basically it means the wealthy have to contract and converge with the necessary growth among poor countries. But then I put all of this in the context of ecological footprinting. And the fact of the matter is we're in overshoot now. And that means that average levels of consumption today are insufficient to remain within carrying capacity. In other words, if nothing happened, if we just maintain the current level of consumption and distribution, or even the current level of consumption with totally fair distribution, we'd still crash, because we are not sustaining the biophysical basis of our own existence. We're destroying the soils, we're overfishing the seas, we're polluting the oceans, the atmosphere is filling up with greenhouse gases, not just carbon. We're beginning to see the meltdown of the ice sheets. We're seeing the release of methane. Hydrogen is an absolute disaster if it takes off in a big way for some of the reasons that I think Erik already mentioned. So we're thinking in entirely the wrong directions here. Overshoot is a problem of too many people consuming too much on a finite planet that's actually getting smaller because of the depletion of the biophysical basis of human existence. Obviously, if you're going to reduce that impact, you have to reduce energy and material throughput, full stop, period. And almost everything that we're willing to discuss in the mainstream involves massive capital investment. It's oriented toward job creation, maintaining the status quo, and so on and so forth. A wonderful paper a few years ago by a British ecological economist made the point that everything Clive Spash is his name, everything we are trying to do makes it sound as if capitalism and growth is the solution to, rather than the cause of, the problems that we are in. And of course, we have a mindset that it just welcomes that perspective, right? It's absolutely what we believe profoundly in is the growth of our economy, that capitalism has saved us all from poverty and all the rest of it. Well, it has, some of us at any rate, but this is a finite planet. Circumstances change. This is not the same world as it was even 50 years ago. I'm almost 80 years old. I was born in 1943. Since my birth, 90% of the fossil fuels ever used on Earth have been consumed. 50% in just the last 30 years. Now, this is the nature of exponential growth. Everyone expects the economy to increase by double again by 2050. That's a what, 2.8% growth rate. What exponential growth means, if we just maintain the current average levels of material consumption, in the next 30 or 28 years, more energy and material will be consumed than in all previous history. And in fact, many of the things that will be consumed more than in all previous history weren't even being consumed in 30 years ago. So we are on a finite planet blindly pursuing an ethic and a way of life, which is completely incompatible with the ecological constraints in which we operate. We pretend that we're decoupled. We are not decoupled. That's a false accounting, Miriam, I have to say. I mean, what you're showing are correct numbers, but it's not the story. It's not the whole picture by any means. So I think we're in much deeper trouble than 99.9% of the population and policymakers and politicians understand. And we are simply unwilling to take a good hard look at the nature of the biophysical realities in which we find ourselves. That's my rant for the day. I think I'll leave now, Erik.
Don't go yet.
You think you're
No, don't leave.
I think in context of that rant and a couple of the questions in the comments, I would like to add just a quick point, because there's this question of, what if people are trapped in these worldviews and are resistant to change, how are we going to make changes? And I think, and Randy Hayes asked an earlier question about, are there any degrowth campaigns? So I think we have to be looking at, nesting these immediate changes. Miriam's good example of kind of trying to work within the system and create new limits, but also this deeper work around normalizing degrowth head on. That's direct cultural change, but also like Juliet Shore's work and others who are trying to embed degrowth strategically, perhaps never using the term, through reducing working hours or through regaining women's rights around maternity leave and paternity leave, so that overall we're working less, so overall the economy is slowing down. So I think there's many strategies. Whether any of them can pull that dotted line, which Bill, I like that graph, but the dotted line was starting when we were at way lower, but we're up here, as you said. So that dotted line is going to be much more brutal, even if we choose to degrow rather than let the ecological systems collapse and force us into economic contraction. And that would be like my last point, because one of the other comments asked about degrowth chosen versus not. And I think the grandfather of all degrowth conversations, Serge Latouche, made it very clear that degrowth and economic collapse are not the same thing. One is like a diet, choosing to eat less. The other is like being starved, right? So we can choose economic degrowth because we are a smart species and get there and have the pain lessened and have the pain better distributed among many people, or we can just wait until the Earth systems change so much that we have hundreds of millions or even multiple billions of casualties in this transition. That's my little rant. So let me see who else has questions by hand. I think we got the comment ones done.
I think there's a comment about authoritarianism in there. There's several conversations going in the chat about authoritarianism. So I just want to say one thing on that, Erik, because we talk about this at our degrowth coffee hour, degrowth by design or degrowth by disaster. But if you want to have a successful design that actually gets implemented, people have to be kind of mentally ready for it and advocates for it, really. So otherwise you get authoritarianism, or like in a way that's the definition there is that it's kind of anti what the people are asking for. So I think of degrowth as just very clearly twofold effort. One is changing the imagination about what the good life is and what the future looks like. And then two is a very deliberate policy environment around to structure limits. And then you can have that degrowth plus all the other things. You can do degrowth plus efficiency, degrowth plus diversification of energy resources, degrowth plus electrification. But if you don't get the first part right, which includes imagination and policy, then the other stuff's just going to feed into business as usual. That's kind of the framework I've found is effective to talk about it in a group.
Hello.
Yep.
Can I say something?
Of course.
Hey, Bell.
Hey, John, good to see you, young man.
Sir.
So I just spent almost a year in North Africa trying to introduce precision agriculture, hoping that will help with the environment and production and all that. And what I found out, which is it's quite poor over there in general. People are not eating too much because they don't produce too much. But why don't they produce too much? Because they really don't feel that they need to produce too much because they don't eat too much. And I think our issue on this earth is we eat too much. We waste too much. So coming out of Ramadan, I made it a resolution for me this month to eat the minimum I can and see what I can get after 30 days. So we are at the 28th day now. And I lost a bunch of pounds. My wallet is fatter a little bit. I saved a lot of money. And I think that directly affect if everyone or if some of us do that, it's part of the solution. We just waste too much. We just eat too much, and we feel bad if we don't have 3 dishes, 4 dishes on the table. Sure, in the Islamic world, I guarantee you that in Ramadan is the month where they eat the most of the 11 months, which basically they're really going against the solution. So I think it's about consumerism. It's about using too much, eating too much. It's that where the problem. And as long as we encourage people in anywhere in the world that you should work hard, eat more, so you can have a bigger house, so you can have a car, so you can this, that's the wrong path. I think the one of the solutions will be let's not eat too much. Let's have everyone fast. And I am not radical in any way. You know, just this is my 64 cents that I want to share. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Bell. Good to hear from you. If Erik, if you're not going to jump in, I'll jump in and give a plug for the Gaian Way. But if you go, when we're going to post the information on this talk at gaianism.org. But people are desperate for a spiritual pathway to imagining limits and accepting them and living in harmony with them. And so there you'll find a lot of information that Erik and Gaians have put together along with our presentation. Just a little pitch for you, Erik.
Thank you, John. Thank you. I appreciate you making that pitch. And Bell, thank you for the comment. I think Ramadan is a time of fasting, and we also try to cultivate a full moon and new moon fast in the Gaian community, which is another opportunity. But your point about a fattening wallet as you're getting thinner is another great example of the rebound effect. So hopefully that those dollars will not go into buying new things, but maybe donating to environmental initiatives in your area.
As long as you determine that those initiatives don't increase the footprint, the best thing you could do is go tear up the money. Just throw it away. You know, we're caught in something here called the public good free rider problem. Somebody just posted a note saying that we need more voluntary simplicity. And again, that's true. If everyone decided to live on the most modest material level possible, much of this problem would go away. But we're not going to do that. We're embedded in a system that is the anathema to that idea. And one of the reasons that people don't do that sort of thing is that supposing I make an enormous sacrifice in my life. I give up my big house. I don't have a big house, but if I had one, I give it up. I don't drive a car. I walk everywhere. I use nothing but, use clothing and so on. I make a very considerable sacrifice in the quality of the life, at least the material aspects of it, that I might enjoy. So I take an enormous personal hit for the public good. I'm giving a gift to the global community. But my share of those benefits are infinitesimal. So I make a big sacrifice for nothing. Meanwhile, everybody else gets the majority of the benefit. And the rebound effect works that way too. If I get my car off the road, it simply makes less congestion. So somebody else goes and buys a second car for their family. So we have the free rider problem. People will take a free ride on your personal sacrifices if they don't share your beliefs, values, and assumptions about the nature of the dilemma we're in. This is a collective problem. I know in the United States, it's dangerous to make statements like this, but you are not going to solve the sustainability conundrum, the overshoot conundrum, with individual actions. Individuals can do wonderful things. I'm not for a moment suggesting that you don't do that, but the heavy lifting requires massive policy changes implemented on behalf of society at large. You as an individual cannot create the system of ecological tax reform that would actually make efficiency work. For example, an idea here. Efficiency doesn't work because it tends to lower prices. The more efficient a company gets in manufacturing something, it can sell those things at lower prices, so consumption goes up. But what if we had a tax system that doubled the price every time efficiency doubled? That means that you'd be using half as much material when you bought a new efficient entity, but you'd still be out of pocket as much. So there's no incentive for the rebound effect to take place. And government has a revenue stream they could use to, for whatever, reinvest in the natural capital endowment of the country. So there are ways around this that we're simply not willing to talk about. People don't want their taxes raised, but we have to do that because right now, we are not paying the full social cost for almost anything, right? We are offloading. Economists call it, I forget the term. It's an externality. Most of the costs of production are externalized. The pollution of our streams, the pollution of the air, atmosphere, the soils, and so on, is a real cost of production that you don't pay for. But if we had to pay for those things, the cleanup of the oceans and so on and so forth, the cost of all goods and services would rise to their real cost of production. And much of this problem would be solved because two things would happen. First of all, consumption would decline because people couldn't afford most of what we now take for granted. But more importantly, it would create an incentive for the corporate sector to get busy to produce things with a fraction of the current energy and material, because if they didn't do that, nobody's going to buy their products. So there are things that can be done, but we don't discuss them in our culture because they are anathema to the current mindset of growth and efficiency at all costs. Keep in mind, we have, since the 1950s, employed across the world something called neoliberal economics, which starts from the assumption that the economy and the ecosphere are separate entities, that there's no important relationship between them, because human ingenuity is the real important resource. Human beings are clever enough to create any substitute they want for products of nature. So once you believe that the economy and the ecosphere are separate entities, and that human beings can substitute for anything in nature, you have a mindset that enables exponential growth or unlimited growth with no cost. Well, who wouldn't want that, at least in our mindset? And that's where we are. We're embedded in this, and we've spread it all around the planet today. And it's a completely inappropriate, inaccurate, wrong model of reality, because we're not separate. We are completely contained within the ecosphere. And the growth of the human enterprise necessarily means the diminishment of nature, the destruction of other species. We have seen in the last 35 years a 70% collapse in the populations of terrestrial vertebrates. Did you hear what I said? In the last 30 years, 35 years, a 70% collapse in the populations of monitored terrestrial vertebrates. That's an astonishing impact that we don't pay any attention to. This cannot continue without the destruction of the planet and essentially the destruction of the biophysical basis of the human enterprise. So we are on a path to self-destruction. We don't even recognize it because we're not allowed to use the vocabulary necessary to raise these things to the table without people freaking out. I said I wouldn't rant anymore, but I'm a lawyer.
I'm glad you stayed for a second rant, Bill. Mike, question.
You're on mute, Mike. You're muted. Mike, mute.
Sorry about that. Thank
There
you.
you go.
I just like to throw out what might be a new idea. The climate change community has to some extent given up on getting greenhouse gases under control, less than 400, less than 350. And I've seen their strategy move to something a lot of them call resilience, which is mostly paying attention to, hey, build coastal buildings higher, and stuff like that, but not dealing with sustainability at all. And I wonder if we who see the problem is much bigger than just climate change should come up with a solution that's akin to resilience, but sees the big picture. Dealing with much more than dealing with floods and warmer weather, dealing with the higher traffic and running out of water and all the plastic and trash and so on. Just a thought that maybe might, have some merit.
Thanks, Mike. I think that touches on two things. Like, one is semantics and vocabulary that we use to introduce these concepts, and then two is kind of where you start, like kind of where you start with introducing degrowth. Do you start from the limits aspect? Do you start from quality of life? Do you start from ecological disaster? And I think at least there's so many communities experimenting with how to talk about this. But I will say that resilience has totally failed as a framework, because it's just, like you said, leading us to build more. It's turning into just padding the economy. And so that one's definitely failed. I'm not sure it can be redeemed with that word, at least. But I think it's an interesting concept to kind of speak more to the threat in a in a responsible kind of way. The one problem is you got to break the bad news to people that life within limits includes less square footage per person, less miles per person. That has to be the quantitative meaning per capita, especially for us here in the comfy global north, has to be communicated. If it's not understood, then everything will be interpreted as authoritarianism and unethical, which Bill mentioned.
I just want to add one thing to what John said. Yeah, and the more capitas there are, the less there is per capita. Right? The more capitas there are, the less there is per capita. So people who insist that we ignore the population crunch, who don't recognize that we're already in overshoot, have to really come to understand that if you have a pie with 8 slices and 12 people, you've got a big problem. And if the people are increasing to 13 and 14 and 15 and the pie is shrinking, I'm sorry, it just doesn't work. So we do have to face the population problem. Keep in mind that if it's true, and I think it is true, that the richest quarter of the world's people have consumed and cause 75% of the problem, then raising the poorest quarter of the people will double the total impact. And if we're already in overshoot, that's an unsustainable, completely earth-destroying kind of solution. And yet that's the track we're on. You cannot raise the poor, the undernourished, the economically unprivileged to anything like our material standards. We have to reduce our consumption. And as I say, globally by about 45%, and in rich countries, 80% or more. And that's the nature of the reality. This isn't racist. It's an absolute situation all of us have to face.
It's a good addition, Bill, and I think I'm glad you brought up population. I was going to bring it up as well, because it is an elephant in the room, and it doesn't mean reducing populations in far off lands. It means everywhere. It means the total global population. But I would push back, John, on your point about resilience, because I think, it's old now, the article, but I think it came out in the Solutions Journal, where really we should be pursuing that 2x2 grid, where everything that we choose to invest in societally, economically, should be both cultivating sustainability and resilience, right? So people shouldn't be putting electricity generators in their homes. They should be, prioritizing things that make their homes more resilient, like rainwater barrels, but also help to secure, capture rain runoff, right? So it's actually improving town sustainability and town resilience. But because I think the ecological changes are here, they're going to come faster. So resilience is not to be poo-pooed. I mean, there's a value in making our communities more resilient to get through these challenges, hopefully, as they're also making major reductions in their consumption and throughput and cultural shifts, like having fewer children, so that we can stabilize and get to a degrowth future.
Yeah, it's the degrowth plus. I agree, degrowth plus resilience, but degrowth has got to lead, and I think it's got to lead the population too, because you could have a small population that consumes like Americans, right? So you got to do, in all these situations, you've got to do both, but you definitely have to talk about those material limits, material and carbon limits that Miriam talked about.
Yeah, I think it's important to focus on, I guess, degrowth for those who consume the most. And when thinking about population, it's very important, and we do need to decrease the rate at which our population is expanding. But I think one way to avoid some of the ethical implications that come with directly, saying we need to cut population, how do we do it, is focusing on measures that improve quality of life that also indirectly would lead most likely to population reduction. So investing in initiatives that educate women and girls and empower them to make their own decisions and participate in politics. Those are things that I think should be given more priority. Or maybe if we want to address population, that's how you start to do it.
I want to agree with Miriam. I think that's an extremely important input to the whole discussion. We have to make it possible for greater control over the reproductive rights. Of course, we're going in the opposite direction in the United States. But there's another side to this. And when I talk about population, I'm talking about in first world countries as well. Because one fewer Canadian, I'm Canadian or American, is equivalent to 20 fewer Bangladeshis or 10 fewer East Indians. I'm not sure if those ratios are exactly correct. But right now in Canada, we're lamenting the fact that our natural reproduction is failing. In other words, we have to sustain our population through in-migration. I think every country that has gone through the demographic transition should be attempting to accelerate that. We should be trying to get to the point where we honor countries, particularly wealthy countries that are shedding population, because that means massive reduction in the per capita ecological footprints of those nations, or rather the aggregate footprints of those nations. So if you talk population control, you really want to talk about it in first world countries, at least as loudly as you do in third world countries. Because as I say, every fewer person on average in North America is about 5 fewer people in on the average on planet Earth. We're way out of line in our consumption.
All right. Well, I'm getting the sense that perhaps population should be our next annual Climate Faith Week talk, perhaps under the moniker "Be Fruitful and Multiply?" ? So I think we're at a moment where I'm going to give just a quick pause. If anybody has a burning question, this is your final chance. Dick, are you raising your hand?
Yes, I am. I'm a local organic horse-powered farmer with an independent farm in New York State. I know this is brilliant conversation. It's vexed me for a very long time. And I know that there are so many people here with such great accomplishments in their own field, but to me, I think the universities are largely need to be reconstructed. We need to have people like yourselves and the paleontologists and the archaeologists and the astrophysicists and all other kinds of people, the technological people. They need to be talking more with the more cultural formation groups, even divinity schools, who are, I think, a terrible, terrible problem, and greatly repress the imaginations and greatly repress the self-confidence of individuals. Just the opposite of what they talk about. Where I've invested a great deal of my time as well with Yale University, and also the politics. Our politics now, with the great financial sectors, really control our society, and the great technological groups. There may be 10 or 15 people. No one. They're totally unregulated. Not totally, but they're so largely unregulated that is authoritarianism. They create most of the conditions which govern most of our hours of the day and even the parameters of our dreams, because they produce the product. They now produce the process, the policies, not the government. So that we need to have this conversation led by science, which always says honestly, it doesn't have the truth, but it's strictly about the truth. Certainly religion cannot talk about that in an honest and authentic way, because they don't. Okay. So that I so much applaud this conversation. I'm so terribly glad that I just ran across this 10 minutes before you started. And I hope you all have the greatest health and good cheer. And I have a grateful heart about what you've done. And I hope to be able to be a part of listening to your community in the future.
Thank you, Dick. That was not a plug. That was not a plant, I should say. Thank you so much for the kind words. And let me thank Bill, John, and Miriam for your time today, and everybody for joining us. If you did enjoy this conversation, we have regular events which you can find on Gaianism.org under the upcoming events page. We have monthly book discussions and film discussions and many other opportunities to keep deepening our understanding of the living earth that we are embedded in and not separate from, including our economies, as Bill noted. So just an opportunity to really deepen our understanding and continue these important conversations. So thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thank
And
you.
we will get a video up online too as soon as we can.
And I'm going to drop my email address in the chat if you want to make sure you get that link, and any recap stuff, I can reach out just in case, but definitely monitor the Gaian Way social media and website, right, Erik?
Exactly.
Great. Super.
Thanks. This is really fun.
Everyone.
Bye-bye now.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.